Hello, my name is David Nutt. I'm a psychiatrist and I'm a professor at Imperial College London. My specialty is neuropsychopharmacology, which means I study the effects of drugs on the brain. And my claim to fame is I've probably given more different kinds of drugs to human beings than anyone alive, which is why I'm the perfect person to be giving you this little talk.
So on this series, we've been discussing the facts about drugs. You have spent your life doing drug science, and I believe you were voted one of the 100 most important and influential figures in British science. But your views haven't always been met with enthusiasm. Can you explain why the conversation around drugs is so hotly debated?
Well, yes, it's because drugs are thought about by the powers that be in political terms rather than in scientific terms. So I got into very hot water with the government. I was sacked as the government's chief drugs advisor because I said what was true, what everyone knows is true, which is that alcohol is the most harmful drug in Britain, not because it's the most harmful drug to the person, but it's so widely used. And if you care about the harms of drugs, you try to stop the damage that alcohol does. But the government at that time, which was the Labour government in 2009, they didn't want to believe, they didn't want to upset the drinks industry by saying it was a drug. They wanted people to be scared of drugs like ecstasy and new psychoactive substances, methadone and that, because it served their narrative that they were strong on drugs, tough on drugs. So drugs have been a political football, and that's why it's very difficult to get the truth out there in the public domain, because the powers, the establishment doesn't really want you to know.
And can I just ask where this all started for you? How come you got into drug science in the first place?
I got interested in drugs when my very first day at university. 9 medical students down in College, Cambridge. What do? We go to the pub. What happens? We come back from the pub, we go into a room and people carry on drinking. And then at about midnight, one of them just starts to cry and wail and scream. There's another guy there who knew him. He said, no, he's always like that when he's drunk. And I thought, really? Wow. That's a powerful drug, alcohol. And that was really when I thought, wow, drugs change the brain. Because people may not realize, but the brain is actually a chemical machine. It's full of neurons, which send electrical impulses between each other. But the connections between neurons are made by chemicals. So I've always been fascinated by the use of drugs to understand the brain, because drugs perturb the chemical basis of brain conduction.
Most people agree, broadly speaking, that drugs are dangerous, and there are dangers associated with drugs, and drug use in this country is clearly a problem. Some countries have decided to legalize and regulate certain drugs. Why have they chosen to do this, and how successful have they been in reducing the harm around drugs?
Well, there are 2 really good examples. Let's start with the oldest one, which is the Dutch one. The Dutch coffee shops. Everyone's heard of the Dutch coffee shops. They've been around for 40 years. It's basically a place where you can go buy and smoke cannabis. And they were set up by the Dutch government because they wanted to break the link between hard drugs, heroin, cocaine, and cannabis. And in almost every other country in the world, including Britain, if you go and buy cannabis, on the back streets, you're always going to be offered a harder drug. And it makes economic sense for the dealer. They want to get you addicted to something like heroin, which is much more profitable than something like cannabis. So the Dutch said, let's let our young people go and get cannabis in a coffee shop and separate those markets. And it was amazingly successful. The Dutch virtually eliminated heroin use in young people, whereas we now have the highest levels of heroin deaths in Britain we've ever had. So that was the first example. And then the other, even more radical example was Portugal, which about 16 years ago was essentially, the economy was crumbling under the pressure of putting people who use drugs in prison. And they said, okay, this is not working, so let's do something different. So they decriminalized personal possession of all drugs. And that means basically, if you're caught with drugs on you in an amount which is compatible with personal use, they don't put you in prison, they don't give you a criminal record. If you're addicted, they treat you. And if you're just using inappropriately, then they put you through what's called an educational program. And that has been a fantastic success. I mean, it's reduced the number of drug users, it's reduced the number of criminal activity, it's reduced the number of people in prison. And the most striking statistic is this. In the 16 years since the Portuguese brought in their experiment, which they did for economic reasons, deaths from opiates have fallen to 1/3 of what they were before, because opiate users can get treatment as opposed to scoring on the back streets.
And obviously, as you mentioned, we're doing things completely differently. We're criminalizing people for taking drugs. Why has the criminalization of certain drugs led to a potentially more dangerous drug scene in the UK?
That's a very big question, because when you look, it depends. Almost any drug you look at, you discover that the criminalization results in the production and sale of more potent substances. I mean, so the most obvious example, and the worst example in a way in Britain, is criminalizing cannabis. So cannabis has been around for thousands of years. It became a focus of criminal attention back in the 1950s. So they tried to stop people using it. So what happened? The cannabis dealers, they couldn't get their supplies from Morocco or Lebanon. They started growing their own. And when they grew their own, they grew skunk. They grew very strong cannabis, because that's where you get maximum benefit for the amount of plant you grow. Now, skunk is much more dangerous than traditional cannabis for two reasons. One, it's much stronger. So it's like drinking pints of vodka rather than drinking pints of beer. But on top of that, forcing the plant to grow very strong THC, the strong stoning ingredient, means that the plant can't grow something called cannabidiol, which is a protective element. So traditional cannabis was a mixture of THC and cannabidiol, and the cannabidiol helped minimize some of the negative effects of the THC. Now it's super strong THC, no cannabidiol, no protective effects. And so we're getting more dependence and we're getting more psychotic reactions to the cannabis.
What are the specific dangers of the fact that by criminalizing something, we are just creating a market for more potent and more toxic drugs?
We've got the problem of the fentanyls. So fentanyl is a very strong opioid. It's a painkiller developed as an alternative to morphine, because back in the 1960s, international controls on morphine were such that people couldn't get enough painkillers in the world. So companies started making these alternatives, these fentanyls. Fentanyls are 50 times more potent and half the price.
Wow.
Now we've got fentanyls on our streets. People are putting fentanyls to replace heroin, but they're also putting it into other substances. They're putting it into other drugs. They're putting it into they're putting it into spice in order to give a bit more kick. And people are dying. And we had 70 odd deaths from fentanyl last year. In America, they had 70,000 deaths.
And can you give me some examples of how science is helping to reduce the harm done by these sorts of drugs?
Well, science has come up with a number of really interesting alternatives for people who use drugs. And I mean, the classic example is if you're a heroin addict, you can give a medicine called methadone to allow people to avoid the withdrawal from heroin, and not have to go out and seek it and commit crime to get it, so they can be stabilized over a period of time before they're weaned off. So that's a sort of classic example of the pharmacological approach to helping people. And that's called harm reduction. So the idea of you giving someone something that is a bit like what they want, but is actually much less harmful. And then beyond that, we're looking at a fundamentally different way of approaching the problem, which is looking at people who are addicted and seeing if we can find medicines which will interfere with the brain processes of addiction. And there are several of these. There's the stress circuits of the brain cause people to take drugs and get addicted. Sometimes it's the mood circuits of the brain. So we're now trying to develop medicines which will help people control their desire to use drugs without actually being addictive at all.
Now, drug scientists are appearing in festivals now. Can you talk to me a little bit about the work of some charities like The Loop?
People who take drugs generally don't want to come to harm. But at present, almost all the drugs they use are illegal. So they buy them on the black market and they haven't a clue whether they've got fentanyl in them or whether they're what they say they are. You just don't, how can you possibly know? And so what The Loop have done is they've set up testing facilities in festivals where you can take along your pills or your powders and they'll test them and then they'll tell you whether it is what you think it is and give you some indication of how strong it is and also give you some indications of what might happen if you were to take it.
And given everything that you have learned since your time at university to now, what would your advice be to teenagers listening to this?
The first thing is if you're taking drugs, never inject. If you're using a new drug, never do it when you're drunk. If you're using a drug and you're not entirely sure what it is, take a tiny bit first just to make sure it's not much more toxic than you think. And also, I suppose if something bad happens to you or your friend when they're taking a drug, get help. So many people, particularly opiate users, die because their friends are scared that they'll be arrested if the police come and find them with the drug. They won't. They'll be taken to hospital.